My name is Angela, and I'm the first Kenyan to win a Wimbledon Grand Slam. My sister Rosie and I are tennis players. But tumetoka mbali, we were orphaned tukiwa wadogo, and our life became such a struggle.
To forget our challenges, our uncle took us to the tennis court. Hapo, all our worries went away. The sport became our inspiration, our escape, and we were determined to keep practicing and pushing our game.
Until one day, we made it to the top of international tennis. Kama sisi tuliweza, there is no reason you can't too.
Against all odds, Angela and Rosie found a way to bring their dreams to life and became international tennis stars. We believe you can also do the impossible. That's what we call Africanacity. Whatever your goals, join ABSA today, and together we can get things done.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening from wherever you are tuning in, and welcome to this interesting conversation on why men make more, hosted by the Aspen Institute's Africa Initiative in association with the ABSA Bank. We are proud to have our partners, PayScale and UN Women with us today as collaborators. And my name is Daniel Ayelabola from the Aspen Institute's Africa Initiative, and I'll be your host for this informative session today. And I am glad that you could all join us. So something brief about the Aspen Institute is that it has been in existence for the last 74 years. And at the Institute, we drive change through dialogue, leadership, and action to help solve the greatest challenges of our time. At the Aspen Institute's Africa Initiative, we foster enlightened leadership that take a moral and intellectual contribution to the development of society in Africa and around the world. So we are very excited to take on this very interesting conversation today on navigating the gender pay gap. But before we begin, I'd like us to run through some housekeeping. In case you have any questions, please feel free to click on the Q&A button and share your questions with the panelists. With this kind of conversation that will generate comments and conversations amongst the guests, please feel free to use the chat button. You can also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag GetSmarter, capital G, capital S. And our social media handles are at Aspen Africa on Twitter and Aspen Institute Africa Initiative on LinkedIn. So we are very welcome and we are very glad to have you with us today. I'd like to introduce our speakers for the day who will take us through this very interesting conversation. I'd like to start with the director of the Aspen Institute Africa Initiative, Dr. Laila Macharia. Raised in Kenya, Namibia, and Somalia, Dr. Laila is a serial entrepreneur and investor based in Nairobi. She chairs the board of the Africa Digital Media Institute, Eastern Africa's premier learn and work creative technology community, which over the last decade has trained over 5,000 students from over 30 different countries. Laila also serves as a non-executive director of the Aspen Institute's Africa Initiative, as well as the ABSA Bank of Kenya and Centum, both listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. So let's put our virtual hands together for Dr. Laila. Thank you. I'd also like to introduce Mershabin Alarahia, UN Women. She is the Regional Policy Advisor on Women's Economic Empowerment for the Eastern Southern Africa Regional Office of UN Women. She leads the regional portfolio on women's entrepreneurship and employment, including with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, transforming the care agenda in East and Southern Africa, and supporting women's economic empowerment through climate resilient agriculture in the region. The regional portfolio covers 25 countries in the region, including emerging economies, conflict and post-conflict economies, and small island states. Mershabin has previously worked in the Eastern Europe region, leading a multi-country project on women's economic empowerment based in Georgia. And she also has extensive experience in Tanzania both with UN Women, UNFPA, donor agencies, other NGOs, and national NGOs working on a range of issues, including women's economic empowerment, sexual reproductive health, and rights for women and youth, human rights, and civil society. Again, let's put our virtual hands together for Mehjabin. Thank you for being with us. I'd also like to introduce Elizabeth Ochua from the Absa Bank. She is responsible for commercial and SME banking, trade and cash management in business banking, Islamic banking, vehicle and asset finance, and agribusiness. Under SME, she is spearheading women in business proposition with proactive partnerships, including the International Trade Center, and SHE Trades, Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Kenya Private Sector Alliance, and Kenya Association of Manufacturers. We are very privileged to have you, Elizabeth, with us. Thank you. Let's put our hands together for her. And finally, Amy Stewart from PayScale, who's the Associate Director of Content and a lead writer for PayScale's compensation research team, which conducts unique analysis on PayScale's proprietary salary survey data and publishes reports such as the Compensation Best Practices Report, the State of the Gender Pay Gap Report, and the Remote Work Pay Strategies Report. Amy has 15 years of experience in content marketing focused on research and analysis of structured and unstructured data. Thank you very much for being with us. Amy, let's put our hands together for her. So at this point, to give us a brief welcome, I'd like to invite Elizabeth Ochua of the Absa Bank, Kenya, to please give us a brief welcome. You're welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're tuned in. On behalf of Absa Bank Kenya, I'm truly delighted to join you today and to welcome you warmly to this important symposium on bridging the gender pay gap. At one time, the former United States Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, once quipped that women are the largest untapped reservoir of talent in the world. For many years, that was the case across the corporate sector. However, the tide has since changed as the number of women steering and shaping decisions at the board and management level is steadily increasing. We are now seeing more and more women making an impact across various industries. The financial sector is included as well. But despite great progress in the recent past, I believe more can be done. We need bold, systematic interventions need to be made to ensure we remain firmly on the path towards gender diversity and inclusion of women. Today's event is therefore really timely and will go a long way in complementing the immense progress that has been made towards advancing this critical agenda. And our participation in this event is really a confirmation of our ongoing commitments to this agenda. Later on, I'll be sharing more details about our journey, but for now, I want to return it to the meeting to the moderator. Asante sana and welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for those nice and powerful remarks. So at this point, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator for the day, Dr. Laila Macharia, who will take it up from here. Dr. Laila, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and welcome everybody to this exciting conversation and really, really timely and relevant. I would like to, on behalf of the Aspen Institute Africa Initiative, welcome you all. The Aspen Institute has been in existence for 74 years now. We'll be celebrating our 75th anniversary next year. We started in the US, but have spread all over the world into 14 international partners. And it's because our idea is really an idea whose time has come, which is the idea of bringing together different parties into dialogue and investing in leaders to help them more purposeful, more contemplative, more deliberate in the way that they lead, and helping them become more enlightened and effective. In this particular conversation, we're inviting you to set aside your preconceptions and come open to learn. We've assembled an incredible group of facilitators, discussants for this conversation who have diverse experience in this field. And to help us really ask those questions that have been niggling around what is it that drives this gender pay gap? What is it that makes it so controversial? But more importantly, if we can understand from a data-driven point of view what is behind the gender pay gap, then we have a higher chance of being able to address the issues that can reverse this problem that is so important to so many of us who have gathered here. So again, welcome. I think we will go right into the conversation. And I would like to start with Amy. For those who are participating, I want you to know that we're going to have the first segment, which is really going to be talking about understanding the problem and the drivers of the gender pay gap. And then later on in the second segment, we'll look at some of the solutions. We know we'll overlap a little bit because when you have experts, we do that. But in this segment, I'd like to invite you, Amy, to come and tell us a little bit about your work at PayScale. And you could start by telling us about the PayScale Gender Gap Report of 2023. And I'd like to give you free rein to explain what is the methodology and the scope of this report before we get into its contents and findings. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Yes, so PayScale, if you're not aware of the company, is a leading provider of salary data, compensation software, and services. Although we are based in the US, our customers are HR leaders and compensation professionals who manage pay for employees all over the world. Very large global companies utilize PayScale for their HR and compensation management policies and processes. One type of salary data we provide is collected through our online salary survey, where individuals tell us what they are currently making at their current job, in addition to demographic information like race and gender, as well as compensable factors like location and the years of experience that they have in that particular field. PayScale has been publishing the Gender Pay Gap Report since at least 2015. I've been involved with this report for over 4 years and have watched the trends change during that time as a lead writer on the report. We have over 65 million profiles within our salary survey data, so the data we collect is very robust and gives us very strong data points in order to make the types of insights and analysis that we do provide in this report. It should be noted that our online salary data is somewhat skewed toward working professionals with college degrees who are paid salaries, but it's still very apt data for analyzing gender pay gap, and we will get into all of the different insights that we are able to provide in the report in 2023.
Great, thank you for that background. And so this report focuses on the US primarily?
Yes, this report is centered around US because we know that we have enough data in the US to provide very accurate information for that demographic group. We do have salary profiles outside the US, but the report is limited to the US for that reason.
Okay, great to know, great to know. Okay, so Amy, what is the pay gap in 2023?
I am so glad you asked. So when we compared the median salary of all women to the median salary of all men, we find that in 2023, women are paid 83 cents for every $1 that men make. So that is a 17-cent pay gap for women compared to men.
Okay, so when we've discussed this with you, you've explained, and this is actually highlighted quite a bit in the report, that there's pay gaps and pay gaps, right? So yes. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this distinction between the controlled and the uncontrolled and help the audience understand what that is and why it's important.
Yes, we get tons of questions about that, and it's very understandable. So sometimes it's called the uncontrolled pay gap or controlled pay gap. Other times you'll hear it referred to as the adjusted pay gap or unadjusted pay gap. These are synonyms for the same thing. So 83 cents is the gender pay gap when data are not controlled for compensable factors such as job title, job level, years of experience, and so on. The intent of uncontrolled gender pay gap research is to evaluate how women are valued in the workforce holistically compared to men. This reflects how women are valued in society compared to men, and is a way to measure inequality. What the uncontrolled pay gap shows is the type of work that women are able to get compared to the type of work that men are currently doing, as well as the monetary value of the work that women do compared to the work that men do. So, for example, because women occupy more service-oriented positions than men, their pay is lower than men. And that is what we are comparing when we're talking about the uncontrolled gender pay gap. However, pay scales research is unique from a lot of other gender pay gap research in that we have so much data that we can also measure the controlled gap. And when we control the data for job title and other compensable factors, we find that women are still paid less. They are paid 99 cents for every $1 that men make in 2023. Now, a 1 cent difference does not sound like a lot, but if you are looking at it consistently year over year in every occupation and every location and every type of work that women do, regardless of whether or not more women or men occupy that type of position, it shows us a statistical underrepresentation or undervaluement of women in work compared to men at a very small percentage. And again, this is just for the US. So what we're looking for is the unconscious bias that is going to be influencing how women are paid compared to men. And that can be something that contributes to the gender pay gap over time in all occupations and in all locations.
Okay, so to understand this better, Amy, I think what you're saying is that if you compare all men who are working and all women who are working within your sample, you find that men have this larger gap, right? Which is the 83 to 100 difference, 83 cents against the dollar.
Women have a gap. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, women have the value. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
women are paid less.
Every dollar that men make. Exactly. But then if you control for their occupations, for example, for how many hours they work, for example, then the gap narrows to what's closer to 99 cents. And again, we can see in your report that even that has a lot of nuances, right? And not every population or location is the same. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. What are some of the differences even within this controlled pay gap?
Yeah, so we have so much data that we're able to do data cuts in order to get at some of those specificities that you have so reasonably brought up. So one of the things we look at is pay gaps by location. For this report in 2023, we looked at metro areas. In previous reports, we looked at states. We could also look at it by region. But what we did find is that the gender pay gap is wider in some locations than others. So for example, metro locations within the US with the largest uncontrolled gaps in 2023 include St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Kansas City. Metros with the largest controlled gaps include Austin, Pittsburgh, and again, St. Louis. This year, some metro areas have actually closed the uncontrolled gender pay gap, which is very exciting because it's never happened before. These include Los Angeles, Portland, San Diego, San Jose, and Washington, D.C. These are these are metro areas that have more progressive politics than other metro states that where we're seeing larger uncontrolled and controlled pay gaps. And then the number of metros that have closed the controlled pay gap have increased since last year. So these include Cleveland, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, Portland, San Diego, San Jose, Tampa, and Washington, D.C. again. So, broadly, you can look at what those states are doing differently if you are interested in measuring the pay gaps within your local area or region.
Yes, and I know this is just the regional one. So maybe you can give us a quick sense without getting too into the solutions. What are these states doing differently that you think is driving this closing of the gap? And it's notable that they're mostly metro areas, right? So big cities.
We're looking at and unfortunately, I can't really answer that because there are so many different factors that go into pay analysis by different states and areas, and I am not in charge of policy for any of those locations. But just broadly looking at it, you can see that cities with more progressive reforms are seeing smaller pay gaps than those that don't.
Okay, so region and location is one. What other things are a distinction in this pay gap?
Yeah, so we also look at the pay gap by occupational groups. And just as a quick, we look at both industry and occupation. Those are different things. So for example, the legal industry is an industry, but legal occupations also include paralegals, secretaries, people who are working within the legal, the legal umbrella of types of jobs. And we find that they're even in every single occupational group, regardless of whether or not there are more women in those occupations, we still see pay gaps for all of them. So Women are paid less than men in every occupational group that we examined, with the largest uncontrolled gaps being in legal, as well as education, training, and library. Education, training, and library is a little bit surprising because there are a lot more women working in those positions than men, and yet they have one of the largest uncontrolled pay gaps. The smallest uncontrolled gaps are in healthcare practitioners and healthcare support. Again, those are fields where women are very active, but it still does not close the pay gap entirely. When we control for the data, so we're looking at equal pay for equal work within job titles that are the same, we see that the gender pay gap closes for transportation and material moving, building and grounds cleaning and maintenance, as well as education, training, and library again. So if you're looking at job title to job title, that has one of the smallest gaps, but if you are not controlling for title, it has one of the largest gaps. And the occupations with the largest pay gaps when data are controlled include farming, fishing, and forestry, which are very male-dominated, as well as construction and extraction, very male-dominated, and installation, maintenance, and repair, which is very male-dominated. So you can draw some conclusions based on the statistics of percentage of women versus men in those occupations, but really it comes down to biases and what we are attributing as more worthwhile work based on whether or not a man or a woman can do it.
So let's just drill down on one of those. So you talked about legal, for example. So in that case, is it because you'll find women tending to be, in the paralegals and legal assistant part, whereas the men tend to be the associates and the partners? Might that explain something like that?
Yeah, that's at least the assumption. So you are seeing more women in service-oriented occupations within that industry, which creates a larger uncontrolled gap because you are seeing women in lower paid work being more servile to the men who are in the higher paid jobs. When you do control for a job title, no surprise, lawyers and who are both men and women will make the same. But it is different when you're looking at the overall types of jobs that women versus men occupy within that occupation or industry.
Yeah, okay, got it. And what about race? How does that fit in the US?
Yeah, so we also do the gender pay gap study by race, and we break it out for women of different races. In a different report, we also do a men's pay gap study by race, but I'm not going to cover that here. Just be aware that is something that we do on occasion. But for the uncontrolled gap, it's American Indian and Native Alaskan women who make the widest gaps when data are uncontrolled. They make 72 cents on the dollar compared to every $1 that men earn. What this means is that more American Indian and Native Alaskan women are likely to occupy lower paying jobs. They're more likely to be getting jobs in service positions like hotel workers and restaurant workers than women of other races. When data are controlled for compensable factors, women who are Black, American Indian and Alaskan Native or white do not achieve pay parity to men. It's 99 cents on the dollar, but it is still a gap there for women of those races. And this means that those women are most likely to be paid less despite having the same qualifications and job titles as men. And in previous years, Black women had the largest controlled pay gap, but we're starting to see that become more equal across other races, at least when data are controlled, which is exciting, but still not to where we want it to be. And then we also see that Asian women consistently make comparatively more than white men when data are controlled for compensable factors, not by a lot, but $1.03 compared to every $1 that men make. And this is a propagator of the model minority stereotype, where people have internal biases that Asians are smarter, better educated, or harder working than other people because of stereotyping and other types of myths. And it's also important to note that Asian is a very diverse population, and some Asian minorities are experiencing wider pay gaps than the general Asian population. So you have to take that into consideration when looking at those numbers. Hispanic and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander women saw a gender pay gap close this year when the data are controlled, which is great. And that should be encouraging, especially if this pattern continues in subsequent years, because we have not seen that before.
This is fascinating, and I know we could really delve into all of this, but it's interesting how you raise this paradox, right? So on one hand, especially when you look at, say, the case of the Asian women, it's good news because it sounds almost like if you are at parity, the same occupation, working the same hours with the same education, we can assume a lot of things, that pay parity is possible. And it looks like in some cases you can even, exceed what this benchmark is that has been chosen, which is white men. But at the same time, you do point out that if we look at it from a bias point of view, there could be something else that's fueling that, which is this, bias could still be playing in somehow and giving some of the more lucrative positions, in organizations and elsewhere to Asian women because of that. Very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about how family plays into this, do you see women over their careers? I've heard it mentioned, and I think this might have been in the report as well, that when women start off with men, they're closer in pay or actually at parity earlier in their careers. But this gap widens over time. Maybe you can tell us what that pocket of data is and what we're talking about in that.
Yeah. So there's a section in the report that looks at job level or seniority. So we look at individual contributors, managers, directors, and executives of men and women. And we also look at it by race for men and women. And we do find that as women progress in their career, the pay gap gets wider. So as you are becoming more proficient and more and gaining more authority and more responsibility, you are seen as earning less than men who are doing who have that same level of seniority or level. So women at the executive level, which is the highest one that we look at, make 95 cents compared to men who make $1, and that is when data are controlled. When it's uncontrolled, women make 72 cents for every dollar that men make when they are both executives. And that's a pretty shocking number. And you can kind of look at the data charts, and it does this. when you get to being an executive as a woman. So definitely something that needs more thought there. And I'm sure we'll talk later about how having more women on the board, having women promoted more is something that organizations really need to be thinking about, and not allowing biases against women for having children or the possibility to have children can be some of the reasons that women are stigmatized in this way.
Yeah, say more about that, because you said having children or looking like you might have children. Right?
You might be able to.
Yeah. Say more about that. How does that play out in the numbers?
So it's something that's called the motherhood penalty, or sometimes the fatherhood premium. And we do ask in our survey, are you a parent? And then we can compare the pay gap for men and women who are parents against men and women who are not parents. And we find that the pay gap closes when you are not a parent, but when you are a parent, it widens for women, but does not for men, which is very interesting and does provide a reason for why women are paid less, so that there is something that is inherently biased against the ability to have, or the possibility, or actually having children to raise at home, which is where this concept of servility and service originates in some stereotyping of the roles of women versus the roles of men. And that's one of the things that I think companies, as well as cities and states and cultures, need to work on to destigmatize, because I like to say men and women are parents in equal number, but only women are penalized for having children.
Wow, there's a lot here again. So you talk about this, women start, in their younger age, kind of at parity. Then as time goes, they get to this executive level where you think they have more control and can influence policies, and you see the pay gap widen, which I see somebody in the chat saying this is shocking, right? That we see that. And then you weave in this thing about motherhood, right? Like whether being a parent plays into that as well, and some of the choices women make, but even when controlled for that, there's still that gap. So I think we can then say that even though we might say that some of the earlier pay gaps that we see are about pipeline issues, maybe choices in occupation or education and the like, that does not explain why women at the senior most level suddenly see this drop off. And that's where we can really, really drill down on bias, right? Another area where we can start to say, at least at the C-suite or in senior management, we really need to drill down as companies, as individuals, as society, around making sure we're not losing women or seeing them fall behind at that level. So thanks very much for this. I think, is there anything else you think you would like to say before we move on to a more global perspective around how we should think about this? We really wanted the audience to have an analytical frame and foundation as we discuss these issues.
Yeah, I love what you said about women who have selected or have chosen. That's often a reason that we hear for people believing that gender pay gap research is a myth or based on something that's not real, because women are choosing to go into careers that are less lucrative than men because they want to have children and have families. And I think that speaks to the general bias that we have around what women's roles are compared to men. And a lot of that social conditioning starts at a very young age. So you have very young girls being informed, not necessarily, words to words, but informed by, media, by culture, by biases that are hitting them, that their role is to be servile, that their role is to be mothers, and men are not given those same messages. They are told that their role is to provide and to earn and to have value, and that to some extent, women are there to serve them. And that is the biases that we are looking to unpack and to try to change, because if we want an equal society, we need men and women equally splitting domestic labor, equally having the opportunity to have lucrative careers, to do the best of their, capacity and work and contribution to the world, and the splitting of parental duties. I think that men are disserviced by having a lack of expectation around the relationships that they should be building with their children. So I think it's good for society all around when you have men and women more equal in society. And that is the bias that we are looking to target with gender pay gap research, as well as pay equity analysis. So all individual companies can and should be doing pay equity analysis, which is, taking this kind of same information and doing it in your organization or your country or your city, and really trying to understand, are these biases affecting us? And organizations that manage pay can do this at a level that even I can't do with pay scale survey, because they have all the compensable factors at hand. And that is the first step to making sure that we are at least closing the gap for equal pay and equal work.
Thank you so much, Amy. Great. Thank you so much we'll be back to you for just a minute, because I see the questions coming fast and furious. I'd like to invite Ahmed Jabin onto the stage, please, and tell us what you're hearing and whether some of these issues and trends that Amy has raised resonate for you. Is this what you see? And then where do you see differences?
So, I think this was very interesting to hear. And at one point I wanted to jump up and say, yay, 99 cents to $1. So we're almost there. But then when Amy started to go into the nuances between the different sectors and this and then, the reality starts to come out, that there are a lot of differences. And, even if it is showing that it's 99% to $1, 99 cents to $1 in the US, there are still things that we need to look at. So, the trends are interesting. In our work, we're seeing some nuances that are a bit different in other countries. But yeah, it's very interesting to hear. And I would like to actually congratulate Amy for taking some highly complicated concepts and making them so simple, because this is something that is always really hard to do with this kind of really technical data and discussion. So
yeah, great. So why don't you tell us? You've been involved in hot off the press research, right, around how the gender pay gap operates in Africa. You've worked on many different countries. Maybe you can tell us about the study, its scope, its methodology, before we go into what you're finding.
Sure. So we are just finalizing a study on the gender pay gap in 10 sub-Saharan African countries. So this is Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa. And these were the countries where we were able to find the data. So what we're using here is national data from household surveys that is representative of the national population. So it does include both the salaried, sort of formal employed, but also the informal employed. And in Africa, we have a large population that is informally employed. But because of the nature of the surveys, there is still not as much of a representation as we would have liked of the informal sector in the data, but they are still there. It is still represented. And overall, this sample that we have is about 60% of the countries in East and Southern Africa, or represent 60% of the population. So we think that generally the trends that we are discussing are kind of applicable across the region, although the challenge that we have in Africa is that we don't have this level of data to be able to always do all the analysis that we want. But we are beginning to see some of it, and I think what's exciting for us is that we haven't seen this kind of analysis done for Africa before. So this is the super exciting part for us as well, to be able to do this.
Yeah, great. So we're excited too. And when we start discussing this report and what you're finding, there's almost no end to the richness and robustness of your work. So maybe we can start by saying, talking about the controlled and uncontrolled. Do you have that same distinction in your data as Amy raised?
Yes, so we've done the same analysis. We call it the raw and the adjusted gender pay gap. So, but Amy talked about that as well. It's the same thing. So in the raw gender pay gap for East and Southern Africa, we are seeing a 26.8% gap, which is basically how does it work out? It works to 73 cents to a dollar. For a dollar that a man earns, a woman earns about 73 cents to that dollar, which is very much in line with sort of the global analysis and the global trends that we see. So that's what we're seeing for the raw gender pay gap. And then when we come to adjusting it, then the gap gets a bit smaller, but it's still quite big. It's at 17.1%. So that means that it's about 83 cents that a woman makes to a dollar that a man makes. So it's still very big for our region, and mainly looking at the formal sector, but also looking at some of the informal sector in that.
Okay, so when you see some of what the distinctions that Amy made, there was something around region. There was something else around race. I don't know whether that was captured. There was something else around, over time in the career of a woman. Maybe you can take each of those and tell us where you see similarities or threads with what Amy talked about.
Yeah. So already we see that in some countries, the gap is much smaller, sort of similar to what Amy was saying about the different regions. And then in some countries, we see it much bigger. In some countries, the adjusted gender pay gap completely explains, and so women become on par with men in those countries. So we do have those countries also in the region, at least from the data that we have seen. So we have the full mix, but we have, so if you look at the specific data, in Namibia, for example, the raw gender pay gap is 13.6%. And in the adjusted gender pay gap then becomes 18. So here you see a reverse, where you see that women have better characteristics than men. So when you adjust for those characteristics, women are actually better employed and getting paid more than the men are in those economies. So we even have situations where we have the reverse. And Namibia and Mauritius are the two examples of that. Now, keep in mind, both of these are sort of middle-income countries in our region, so that might have something to do with what we're looking at and seeing. And then we see also that Tanzania and Mozambique, when you start to do that analysis, the gender pay gap becomes statistically insignificant. So that means that while you see that there is a little bit of it, it's probably some kind of rounding errors and things like that in our data. But it's really, you're not really seeing it. In those countries, we would like to do a little bit more of an analysis of what's happening there. But we suspect that part of it might be, around strong labor regulations. But the other part of it might also be that the public sector is one of the biggest employers. And when you have the public sector being one of the biggest employers, you also find that The salary scales are more regulated, teachers, doctors, and this kind of thing. And so you see less of that kind of those discriminatory sort of tendencies coming out. But this is, to be determined and to be analyzed further. I think, I'm not sure if Amy talked about this or if it's in the pay scale research, but we also started to look at the next step, which is, generally the gender pay gap analysis is done per hour, but we wanted to look at it as over a month. And the reason we wanted to look at it over the month was because we know that a lot of times women may already be getting paid less on the hour, but then because of their other obligations, such as their childcare responsibilities and other family responsibilities, and in the case of rural Africa, that includes fetching water and doing some of the household chores, women are not able to put in as many hours into their work, into the paid labor. So as a result of that, they can work less hours in the month, and therefore they also have a net lower income. And when you start to look at that, then the monthly raw gender pay gap for East and Southern Africa jumps up to 32%. So that means that women are making some 68 or so cents to $1 compared to if you look at it the hourly, where at the hourly level it's 26%. So you see a large difference from 26 to 32% just on the raw gender pay gap. So those were some of the things that we started to look further into, because we also take a broader sort of perspective or image on some of these things. Yeah, and so those, I don't know how we are, but I can keep talking a little bit more about this in terms of marital status and children.
How about education and occupation? Did you see any of that?
Yes, we did. So in terms of education, I think this was one of the interesting things and a difference, I think, from the US data. In terms of the impact of education, we saw that the gender pay gap was higher at the lower levels of education. So when women, if you compare men and women who have only finished or have some level of primary education, the gender pay gap there is higher. And then at secondary level, it gets a bit smaller. At tertiary level, it gets a bit smaller. So we're actually seeing higher levels of discrimination sort of happening at lower levels of education for the really sort of unskilled jobs, where women's work is possibly even less valued than at other levels.
What about this idea that we see in the US that as a woman gets more senior and starts to reach the higher levels, that somehow the pay gap kind of comes back? How does that work that way in Africa? Did you see that?
So it's actually, we started to see it the other way. So the gender pay gap does vary by occupation, and women tend to be more in the care sectors and care related occupations. In most countries, the gender pay gap is large at the average in the top 3 occupations and sectors where women dominate. So even if it's a women dominated sector, the gender pay gap tends to be higher, come back, as you're saying, at that level. But then when we go to the very, very top, to the like top 1%, then we start to see it disappear. So you've got to be at the very, very top to not have it affect you. But as you're going up the ladder, it will still affect you.
Fascinating. This really is so meaty and helpful for policy, right? Like, where do we target our efforts so that we don't dissipate energy? Okay, tell us a little bit about the family. How is it different or the same as the US? Do we have a motherhood penalty? And then I want us to get to sticky floors. You told us about that one day. So this motherhood penalty, how does it play out in Africa?
So the motherhood penalty does play it has a little bit of an impact, but we don't see it as much. So we see that the gender pay gap is actually bigger for single people. So single women and single men tend to make a lot more than single women. But when they get married, the men do see a fatherhood premium. The women don't necessarily see the motherhood premium, the motherhood penalty, but women will fall out of the labor market, are more likely to fall out of the labor market when they get married. So it possibly goes sort of towards our sort of cultural norms around a woman taking care of the household when she gets married, and taking on those very cultural sort of roles. We don't see the same thing with women who are not married, and when I say married, we also include those who are cohabiting, but not necessarily legally or religiously married, right? So women who may be single moms don't see that same effect. So single moms still stay in the labor force, continue to work, and are still able to participate in the labor market, or maybe are inclined to participate in the labor market. It could also be the responsibilities that come with that. So you see, marriage is the bigger factor for this region, rather than having the children necessarily, which is different, I think, from other parts of the world, perhaps.
That's right. That's actually a big difference, because I think a lot of the discussion around the pay gap, I think, in more industrialized countries is around this issue of parenthood and motherhood. And I don't know if your research went that far, if you have any hypothesis about what's really going on with that. Why is the hit of having children, even when you're a single mother, not as severe in Africa?
So we haven't done this research, and that's something I think we will possibly look at in terms of the next iterations of this, as to what is happening there. We actually were assuming this, and then it's only when we did this research that we came to find different, the numbers started to tell us different things. And so this is also a new finding for us in the region. But, just to if I look around, right, this is not at all based on data, but if I look around, at the people around me and at society around me, I feel like there's a lot of extended family support, where, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, neighbors will be part of that childcare ecosystem for a lot of women. And we don't always have that in other parts of the world. So that could be a contributing factor. I think the other factor might just be, that you don't have the social protection systems, right? So you don't have a government that's going to pay you and give you a certain cash transfer because you have children. If you don't go to work, or get some kind of way of getting an income, both you and your child are going to starve. So there is a real So I mean, but this is just postulation right now. We need to do that research in the next iteration, to see what is really causing that change, of that difference in our region. But it's super interesting, and it's really exciting to see, that the policy implications and the way we deal with this is going to need to be different, because our situation is different. So we need to look at that side. If you want to talk about the sticky floor, I know you specifically asked about that. So so what we see is in the gender pay gap at the very, very bottom. So you're looking at the lowest 10% of earners. And at that level, we see that the gender pay gap is bigger. And then it's big there, and then it gets a bit smaller, and then it gets a bit bigger, and then it kind of disappears at the end. So that implies that there's women getting paid less at that very low level, which kind of is what we call the sticky floors, because they're sort of stuck at that very, very bottom level. And the sticky floors is an analogy around like factory floors or workplaces that have very dirty, sticky places, and your shoes get stuck on the ground kind of thing, and that those women are sort of stuck in that space at the very, very bottom of the barrel, the opposite of the glass ceiling, sort of, where the glass ceiling is, a nice glass ceiling you can see, but you can't get through. So
but at least you can see. Yeah. Very interesting. I mean, so there's a couple of things there. So one, I think, is this idea of a very new finding around the impact of family and the family dynamic. And I think in that is something, when we look at policy, to be really careful, because we're so hungry in Africa and many African countries to develop, right? And to really have the state kind of move in and take care of much more. But there's a strength which is kind of lurking below the surface, which is that the community steps in, and this idea of the village raising your children with you. And many of us say in jest, but it's true that parenthood, even two people, it's too much for two people, even four, right? So you need a small army to raise these kids and raise them well, right? So I think there's something in there, and we really look forward to seeing more research from you so that we can learn more about how this works, where it's working and where it might be a burden. What about, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, about that. So one is, I forgot to mention, one is the community, but the other is that domestic workers and caregivers are extremely affordable in our countries. So it means that you would be able to hire someone to be at home with your child, if you're a single mom, or even if you're not a single mom, but particularly if we're talking about single moms, to also be at home with your child while you go to work. So that's
a big one. Yeah.
There's a bigger support system as well that is affordable. And this links into a lot of our discussions around the care economy, where we're looking at, so then how do the carers that we are employing, how are we making sure that they're also being cared about for? And who's taking care of her children when she's taking care of your children, right? Exactly. So there's this sort of compounding effect, but it's also a mechanism of job creation. But then it's jobs in the informal economy and jobs where the pays are relatively low. So there's all these knock-on further conversations to have around this, because we do have that opportunity, but then there's also links back to some of the pay gap discussions we're having.
Yeah, so some of the structures of our economies. And I think that's a good segue into this idea of informality. So in Kenya, where I'm sitting at present in this conversation, we're hearing now that over 90% of the economy is informal, right? So the people who are in formal jobs, that 2 or 3 million people, are a very, very small sliver of the working population. So when you look at the pay gap and some of the things that you're finding, how does informality play into all of this?
So, okay, so there's different data around this, but the ILO estimates are that about 80 to 90% of our population is actually in the informal economy. It's really quite high. And so when you start to look at that it does have implications. Now the data on this is a bit unclear or unavailable. The household surveys that we used do capture the informal economy. So because we don't look at employer or employee data, which is I think a major difference from pay scale, where they look at those who are formally employed and those who are paid through these systems. Our data looks at the government going around asking people, did you work last week? Did you get paid last week? How much did you get paid? And then in some surveys, they ask, do you have a contract for your work? In some surveys, they ask it in a different way, but you are able to sometimes draw out that this was an informal worker versus the formal worker. And the reason for that is because you're more interested in understanding how much they're working and where they're, how much they're working and how much they're making, without putting people into sort of on the back foot to be afraid to say that they're working, because you want to get this data, so it's a lower risk. So anyway, so we do capture the informal economy, but not to the same level, but it does have a big impact. Now, some data of some researchers find that women are, so overall, women are more represented in the informal economy than men. So this is across the board. That's what women tend to be, which means that they tend to be in less protected jobs, less likely to have sick leave, less likely to have health insurance, less likely to have days off, less likely to have maternity leave, all of these things that come with a formal job. There's some research that shows that women are able to make more in those situations on an hourly basis compared to men, depending on the country and the context. And there are some that show, majority of it shows that they make less. And then there's also the entrepreneurship component, right? So you could be an entrepreneur in the informal economy, because if you own your own business and if you don't register it, but you run a home business, that is informal economy, but you could be making millions from your home business, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of nuances in that we can't fully capture yet. And again, I think that will come out in future iterations of these studies or data. But I think generally women tend to be there. Generally, that they tend to be paid less. And I think we can confidently say that. Although that is the trend around the world. So it may be that we come to do this research in our countries and then we find opposite data like we did in some of these things. But that's the global trend that we see, that women would tend to get paid less and oftentimes in worse working conditions and with less benefits.
Mm-hmm. And I know when we talked about geography, we talked about countries, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But what about rural versus urban? Was there anything that came out in that?
Yeah. So I think that was, let me just check my notes, but I think we didn't sufficiently have the data to look at the rural versus urban. We have opinions about it, but I don't think we looked very much at that. But we do know that in the rural areas, women tend to be more in the agriculture sector or as contributing household workers, family workers sort of thing on the farm. And while most of the data currently does count those people as employed, in the future iterations of the labor force survey, and there's been a global change in how this is being measured, those people will no longer be counted as employed. So they won't even be seen as part of the labor force anymore. So in essence, I think what the global community is saying is that those people are not really considered as employed because they're not making an earning. So that's mostly in the rural areas. And then you see some of that in the urban areas as well. But yeah, that's kind of how it plays out.
That's fascinating. It sounds like a step backwards though, because it's one more area in which we're failing to measure work because it feels unseen or it's not commercial. Or do you think it cleans up your data somewhat?
Well, look, labor data overall is a highly contested indicator or statistic. Elections are won and lost over the unemployment statistics. And so if you have people who are in the labor force, but they're getting very little, or they're not, they're earning less, or they can be considered as unemployed, there are political implications around that. And I think what this will have some implications on is that it will show that a lot of the women are actually not in the labor force, which means that we are then able to discuss with governments the labor force participation, because that becomes bigger. And then the conversation is, well, if you really want to develop and if you really want your economies to grow and people to come out of poverty, you need to figure out a way to engage that population that essentially by your own definitions is seen as unemployed or out of the labor market. So it has a broader implications in terms of how we get into discussions of job creation and the types of job to create, because what we need in the economies is jobs that will work for women, to bring the women into the labor force. And that links to all of our other conversations around maternity leave and childcare and family-friendly policies and employment practices. So in essence, it isn't, it provides an opportunity because it gives us the ability to have that conversation, to say you're missing 50% of your population, or 25% or whatever it may be, who are in the agriculture sector but not employed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I think I really want to pull in some of the people who are listening and who have questions. And let's see what we have. So somebody here says, I'm particularly intrigued by the relationship between the gender pay gap and its relationship with underrepresentation of women at senior levels in a lot of industries, especially financial services. It would be super useful if one of the speakers addressed this. Then we said, how can women or men deal with or respond to deep-rooted unconscious bias? Amy has mentioned the motherhood penalty that affects women negatively but men positively. How can we ensure that women's career progression is not hindered by societal expectations and caregiving responsibilities? And then we have somebody who just says, these statistics are shocking, So I think, Amy, maybe you could pick up that. How can we ensure that women's career progression is not hindered by societal expectations or caregiving responsibilities? Maybe you can take a crack at that, a big one.
It's a big question. I think that there are entire, departments within universities and other institutions around the world trying to tackle, that question and just how big it is. From where I sit at a compensation, software company, one of the first things that can be done is to run pay equity analysis with every organization that has the ability to do so. We run our compensation best practices report annually, and every single year there's an uptick in the number of organizations that are saying we are, making pay equity analysis either a current initiative or a planned initiative. I think it was 63% of organizations said that for 2023. Before COVID, I think it was like 48%, so like below a majority. Now it is above a majority, which is great, but I would love that number to be 98 or 99% of organizations that are saying that they are doing that. That's at the professional level. I think the question of, how can we change this at a societal level? It is changing, but just very slowly. So you have to continue to work at it. And some of that is education. It's webinars like this one for folks who are in leadership positions, policymakers, people who are able to make change at a, as small as the city, the city level, but really as big as the country level, to make sure that women and men have at the very bottom equal opportunity to earn value. But it goes beyond that, because the opportunity can be weighed down by things like domestic responsibilities and unconscious bias and some of the things that we've been talking about. I mean, we could get into that more if we have more time, but I want to make sure I leave room for more questions.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Amy. I think I saw a statistic that financial services, as has been raised here by Joanne, is actually one of the areas. There was a big study that came up. She sighs.
I can talk about the finance sector. We didn't talk about this, but in the gender pay gap analysis report that PayScale does, the finance sector is always super frustrating. They hold a lot of the keys to the kingdom, the Wall Street folks in the US and their equivalents around the world. That has one of the largest uncontrolled pay gaps by a wide margin compared to other sectors. And again, it goes back to men are seen or biased, predisposed to being the ones who earn and who make big money, and women are their servants or in servile or supportive positions within that industry, and it's super frustrating. So you can take a look at the numbers. I think it's 77 cents on the dollar in the finance and insurance industry for the uncontrolled gap, and at the controlled gap it's 98. And the next one is agencies and consultancies at 84. So that's already the big gap just between like the lowest one and the next one within that sector. I think we're talking to a banker, someone in the banking industry later in this webinar. And I know that some banks run wealth gap analyses on their populations, and those reports are fascinating to look at as a corollary to the wage gap, because what you earn as an income and what you're able to save as an individual are different things. And I think if you look at the wealth gap, you'll be even more shocked at what women have in terms of wealth compared to men.
Yeah, and just to close out that question, I think what we heard, there was this big study that showed that Goldman Sachs and some others of the investment banks had this huge pay gap. And the interesting distinction was there was the salary, but where it was really kicking was in the bonus, right?
Yes,
so when you're looking at compensation, yeah, you have to look at that.
Yep.
Yeah, so very interesting. But I think the other thing that you've raised is that what gets measured gets done. So as a first start, to respond to the question of how do you start, it's start measuring, right? Do the analysis and then track. And then with that information, it's power. And you can decide what to do after that, but at least you know what you're really dealing with. Right.
Yes, a lot of organizations assume they don't have a gap. Oh, we're not sexist here. The women make all the money. And then they run the analyses and there's always chagrin. We see that all the time of companies being like, oh, well, maybe we do have some challenges in our organization when it comes to recruiting, promotions, pay decisions. And it's, unconscious bias is very sneaky. So you do have to measure. You can't just assume.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you've touched on something else, right? So there's people, they say that there's the idea of pay, but you have to look beyond that to how people are being promoted, all kinds of different, kind of benefits that can come into play. So that's really, really helpful. Mehjabin, what does this raise for you in response to these questions?
So yes, I think I would agree that the measurement is one part of it, and for those that are interested, there is an Equal Pay International Coalition, which is a global coalition, and as an employer, as an organization, as an institution, you can sign up for this. The abbreviation is EPIC. And what they do is they're really trying to get a movement around this. So the trade unions are part of it, the governments are part of it, and they have a lot of education around different things of what you could look at. So that one you can look up for the people who are listening on this. But the other things that also come into play and how you could work on this is looking at even at the policy level, whether we start to look at minimum wage, for example. And I think there was a question somewhere about informality as well. If you have a minimum wage, and in some countries there is a standard minimum wage across the economy. In some countries they have what we call a progressive minimum wage or sectoral minimum wage, which then is like, okay, so domestic workers must be paid this much, factory workers must be paid this much, security guards must be paid this much. So that breaks up the economy into different sectors and sets the sort of a bit of a value towards different jobs. But that helps to increase the wages or the incomes of those even in the informal sector, because it provides a benchmark. So even if you say domestic workers must make, I don't know, $100 a month, even if you don't have a contract, but if your employer says, well, how much do I pay you? You know what to say, because that's what the official salary is for your occupation. So those kind of interventions are also very helpful, like across the board. In terms of policy discussions. But as Amy was saying, internal practices of corporations are also very, very important. And as UN Women, we also have a tool that can be used. We call it the Women's Empowerment Principles. And again, you can look that up. It's weps.org, weps.org. And there we have a tool, basically a checklist that organizations can look through and it helps them to do a self-analysis. And it looks exactly at, the recruitment practices, the work-life balance issues. If someone's child is sick and needs to stay home from school, is it the woman who stays home or is it the man who stays home? What is the extent, is it acceptable in that organization for the dad to say, my kid is sick, I need to go home? Like these kind of things. So it helps to measure all of these and then helps them sort of figure out what they can do about it. And again, these are sort of internal reflections, and it does make business sense, because we've seen that when these sort of when an employer is more aware of the humanity of their employees, it makes people more dedicated to the job. You actually have less sick days, less unexplained absences, less staff turnover. Because people enjoy and are feel respected and valued in that organization. But it also makes sense for the bottom line. So it does also have, better corporate governance practices that have implications for shareholders, in the stock market. So the evidence shows that when you have better employers, it does make business sense. Especially when you're looking at gender equality in the workplace. So you've got the full spectrum from the policy things that could be done, minimum wage or setting a work week. So in many of our countries, we have a definition that says the formal working hours are Monday to Friday and half day on Saturday. I mean, that's the norm kind of in this region. So that's 5.5 working days in the week. That allows you to sort of understand what is the expectation. In other countries, I think it's France now, is like 4.5 days where like Wednesday afternoon is off as well, and Friday and the Saturday and Sunday are off as well. Specifically also because they're trying to encourage the sharing of the care responsibilities and giving people more time to do that. I mean, there's other implications also for it, but this is one of the driving factors. So there's lots of things that could be done, and we could have another whole session about that.
Yeah, so you've talked about, at the policy level, we can talk about the minimum wage, we can talk about even pay transparency legislation,
I was
because
just
you
going to
could
comment
make,
on that. Yeah.
yeah, you could make the public service and the private sector reveal. The thing with us in Africa is that we've just admitted that 90% or 80% of the population is informal. So those solutions will have limited impact, but you did raise the good point of just a benchmark. It gives people somewhere to start from in a conversation and move society along in expectations. And then what about this question that's being asked here about unconscious bias? Because we've said at the policy level, there's something that can be done. But if you're an individual and you're dealing with bias, and then we've said from Amy that at the company level, there's some things you could do around tracking, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what companies could do, Amy, before we go to the individual level.
Yeah, so unconscious bias, a good example of this, and I think it could be baked into the training of organizations, is to help people understand pay equity needs to encompass similar work for similar jobs. And a good example I like to hear, or I like to share with folks is, if you think about what a housekeeper does and what a janitor does, and then you imagine the genders that occupy those different jobs, and then you think about the pay for those different jobs, it's illuminating. So I believe there was a study done, not by PayScale, previously, that examined that exact thing of what do janitors make versus housekeepers, with men and women respectively occupying those roles. And they found that it was wildly different. And that was one of the things that instituted the changes of language for similar pay for similar work, as opposed to equal pay for equal work, where the job title is less important than the responsibilities and the skills of the person who is occupying that job. So that kind of like unconscious bias training of just making people aware of the types of things that they are attributing as the type of work that someone does, based on gender assumptions and cultural norms that we attribute to men and women differently. So in organizations, manager training around unconscious biases can be helpful. Empowering employees to understand how their pay is determined can be extremely helpful. And you mentioned pay transparency, and that is something that is taking root across the world. In the US, I forget how many states now, because it feels like it's changing every day, but a good number of states now have either passed or in process of passing pay transparency legislation. We've seen Europe adopt that, Australia adopt that. Other areas, I think British Columbia has also adopted that. So we're starting to see pay transparency take off, and the goal there is that if you have to be transparent about pay, you need to be able to explain it. And when people see the differences in what they make compared with what is published online, the organization has a fire lit under it to fix any problems that currently exist. And we have research that demonstrates that pay transparency does close the gender pay gap, or reverse statement. Organizations that have high pay transparency have lower, more narrow or non-existent pay gaps, because they have to be confident in the data that they're putting out there, and that can make a huge difference for organizations. So training, pay transparency, and really just better compensation best practices can go a long way in closing some of these gaps that we are seeing.
Thank you. Mehjabin, as I think about this, I realize that many of us do focus kind of on the unconscious bias at the institutional level, because it feels like something you can do, right? We kind of can make companies reveal pay and do all of these things. But the reality is that from what we've seen from the controlled and uncontrolled, that by the time you're in the company, a lot has already happened in the woman's life and the man's life. And there's that whole issue about occupational segregation, which people say really is the big elephant in the room, right? And I wonder whether, as we capture policy that helps people think about how to pay women equally, there's some policies that can come into play around making sure that we mitigate or navigate those career choices in the first place, so that women aren't being channeled into these lower paid professions. I don't know if you have something to say about that, because I know bias kicks into that as well, right? Like, where do you what kinds of jobs, as you said, between the janitor and the housekeeper. What would you say about that measure, Dean?
Biases kick in before the child is even born. Like when the woman is pregnant and, there's this whole thing of, is it a boy or is it a girl? Is it going to be an engineer or a doctor or, a nurse? So it starts so early that the child, by the time they're born, they're already being shaped from that very same, from that very moment, I guess. The toys that we give them, pink toys, blue toys, dolls versus cars, guns, whatever it is, right? So from that very, very early on, we're already shaping this individual into kind of the society's norms and things. And I think so one thing would be already to start at that level, right? With people who are parents, to look at what they're doing, just to be aware of it. Why are you buying pink Lego? You were buying Lego, but you're buying pink Lego. So, but why? And I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up, there was no pink Lego. It was all standard primary colors: red, blue, green, yellow, and white. That's what it was. And then came more and more of this, and now there's blue Lego and green Lego and all of this. But that's an example of the extent of the mind shaping behaviors and the gender stereotyping that we're faced with on a daily basis. So I think each one of us, as champions of gender equality and as advocates, need to catch it in our daily lives. You just need to be a bit more aware of it. It's also in terms of the chores that that kids are trained. Like girls might be more encouraged to be helping and more useful around the house, where boys are told to go and play soccer. Like it's these kind of things also that are reinforcing those stereotypes that her role is in the household, his role is outside. And I think that at that fundamental level is where it starts. And as we go through life, it's checking ourselves each time, every step of the way, as to why am I saying, or why am I thinking, or why is it okay to do this? I mean, one of the things that we had, and I'm really happy that we're breaking these barriers in Africa, but there was a lot of this issue around pilots and stewardesses, and who's doing what. And now we have a lot of women pilots, and on Kenya Airways, actually, a lot of times they will have a woman pilot. And I think on one of the flights I was on a couple of months ago, the bursar actually said, and our captain today is, and she said a woman's name, and that was great. But then I was on another flight, and she's whoever they said, our captain today is the beautiful woman's name. And I was like, but why? Why do we have to say that she's beautiful or not? What difference does it make? She's a pilot. And here today, we're dealing with the fact that she's a pilot. She's going to fly this plane. So it's those things that are so subtle, but they're everywhere. And what we have to do is just be aware and catch it out at an individual level. If for the men, be the role model. Share around the house, be a champion for gender equality, be a feminist, as scary as that may be. But if you want your daughters to grow up in a world where they're treated equally, then you gotta walk the talk from now, and you gotta show them that they're worth it. So I think that at that individual level, that's where it all is, actually, because even that workplace hiring manager is an individual who is dealing with this in their daily life. The employee, the HR manager, the finance manager, whatever it is, all of them, they're all, we're all in this at an individual level, even before we get to the corporate level. And we gotta.
Amazing, thank you. Why that's wonderful is because I think sometimes you feel that this thing is so societal, so large and beyond your control. But this gives you something that you can take back as far as power and say, in my life, or in the people I employ, or in the people that I'm raising as my children, that's where we could start, or in the couple that I'm in. So that really gives us something that we can work with. I'm going to close this in just a second and move over to our closing segment, but I don't want to go without responding to Christine, who also has a question. And this is just about, is it possible for you to become an entrepreneur? And I saw something in, I think, the pay scale studies, perhaps, around being an individual contributor. Is there a way to get out of this whole thing by working for yourself or not wanting to go into management? Is that a way to do it?
Certainly, absolutely. I interpreted this question differently. I think I read it as, women who are already taking that path, can they be role models to other women who are interested in the same? And yes, absolutely. I think one of the ways that we combat opportunity, stagnation and unconscious bias is to show what women can do by doing it. And the next generation then grows up with more role models and more pathways to success than existed prior. So I think more women on the board, more women entrepreneurs, more women in seats of leadership and seats of power, more women, leaders of countries and other high profile positions do make a difference. That includes pilots. And so all of the representation that of the different pathways that women can take does communicate something to the young girls who are seeing what opportunities exist for them. And certainly if you are currently a corporate drone and considering going solo as a woman, women can do it. So if that's something that you are thinking about, definitely look into that and go for it. Don't hold yourself back based on insecurities that you have because of your gender.
Yeah. Wonderful. What a great closing note. That was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming by. We've learned a lot. We've certainly are smarter than when we started. And I think you've given us a language and a way to really tackle this issue, first by understanding it, and then given us very many options for those of us who want to do something but are not always sure where to start. So we thank you very, very much for coming by and hope to see you soon. Thanks very much. I'll then invite, thanks. We'll then have Elizabeth come on board from ABSA, but before she comes on, we'd like to have a brief message from ABSA.
My name is Angela, and I'm the first Kenyan to win a Wimbledon Grand Slam. My sister Rosie and I are tennis players, but tumetoka mbali. We were orphaned tukiwa wadogo, and our life became such a struggle.
To forget our challenges, our uncle took us to the tennis court. Hapo, all our worries went away. The sport became our inspiration, our escape, and we were determined to keep practicing and pushing our game.
Until one day, we made it to the top of international tennis. Kama sisi tuliweza, there is no reason you can't too.
Against all odds, Angela and Rosie found a way to bring their dreams to life and became international tennis stars. We believe you can also do the impossible. That's what we call Africanacity. Whatever your goals, join ABSA today, and together we can get things done.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, welcome. We're very excited to have you here, and we would like to hear, we've heard about all the different things that can be done. And Amy finished on just letting us know that promoting women's leadership, seeing more women as role models is a very important factor in how we can shift the conversation. We'd love to hear more from you about what ABSA is doing in this area and what we can learn from it.
So thank you very much, Laila. I'm really happy to be here to share our story. I think one of the things that we also learn as we growing up is sharing is caring. And when you share from a point of what you've done, and perhaps another organization could get to learn, and be strong enough or be vulnerable enough to share what they're doing in the women empowerment story. So from an ABSA perspective, we have a long history in Kenya, and in our history we also realized that the bank had taken very early steps in being able to empower women. So for instance, in 1972 we had Agatha Obare, who was promoted to a position of, she was the first woman to be promoted to the position of branch supervisor, something that was not done those days. And then we quickly followed it up in 1977 with Mary Okello to branch manager. And of course, Mary Okello, as we all know her, Dr. Mary Okello later became the first African representative of women's world banking and the first woman advisor to the president of the African Development Bank. So you can see the history, whether it was, something that was structurally put in place, maybe we had really strong he or she's at that point. We do have histories in terms of how, we've empowered women along the way. Over time, our commitment, of course, to diversity and inclusion has paid off because, if we look at today, our constitute as a bank, 48%, we have 48% representation of women in our employment, in our employee population, which is a really, commendable piece considering the size of the organization. We are over just about 3,000 of us. And this is done because, we monitor this consciously. One of the things we do is we monitor because we want to get better. And it's not to say that we want to disadvantage the men, the men folk. We want to ensure that we create an environment where there's a respected, empowered colleague to reach their full potential and to really, really be able to prosper, free of discrimination and violence. So, these are some of the things that we've done, in our DNA to ensure that we have a better organization. If I look at also, last year, we then got acknowledged for some of the things that we've done systematically over the years. ABSA was named by Forbes among the world's top 40 female-friendly companies on the list of 400 global companies. And on the African scale, on the African continent, we were the best. So there is some good work that has been done across, the ABSA franchise. Then, the fact that we continue to focus on diversity and inclusion as a key agenda, tracked all the way up to board level, of which you already know. But, it is something that we are very conscious of. So there is no giving up on this. It's the right thing to do. It's not just a nice thing to do. It is definitely the right thing to do to empower women across the industry, by telling our story as well.
That's great. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. We've been talking about, how do you push society forward? And I think one of the things that we've seen happen through ABSA is really its ability to have a soft power. And I would like you to share with us some of those initiatives because you're doing it a little bit differently, but yet we're seeing an impact that's moving along the entire ecosystem.
So thank you, Leila. That's also a really good question because, even as an organization, it is not something that we just do one day in a week or, one day in a month. It is something that we've taken into our DNA, as I said. So some of the initiatives, and I'll just share a few because if I dared share all the things that we've been doing, I think we'd be here until tomorrow, which wouldn't be a bad thing, but it's important that I just share a few of them. So from an external perspective, we do some of the initiatives that we've had, or one of the initiatives that we've had that has been very impactful. Started off in 2014, we became the first listed company in the country to achieve 50-50 gender balance at board level. And that set the ball rolling in a lot of ways because, as we told our story, then we realized, our initiative with the Nairobi Securities Exchange, it was really important. And therefore we partnered, with a group called 100 Women in Finance to launch the Kenyan chapter, which includes, we included the ringing of the bell at the Nairobi Securities Exchange with the immediate former governor, Dr. Patrick Njoroge. And something that he said also, caught my attention, and I thought it to share as well to the women today. He mentioned the fact that, it's really a good thing for us to, first of all, as women, get into the boardroom. It is also good to lean in. And, and in that leaning in, we also must get our voices heard. I think that's really relevant today because I think those are some of the problems that we as women have when our voices are not heard in the right places, then we're not able to articulate our pays and so on and so forth. But in this particular organization, 100 Women was founded in 2001, and it brings across 100 senior female investment professionals to better leverage their collective relationships, enhance communication within the alternative industries. I think the guiding principle for us that is really brought us into this organization, it's a shared view, is one where the goals, we're pushing for 30% senior investment roles and executive positions by 2040. But to achieve this is a lot of partnerships, a lot of work has to be done to ensure that we get the right, the right representation in different companies that we work. So that's from an external perspective. From an internal perspective, Absa Bank has been very forthright in being able to set up, women network forums from an internal perspective, led by women, with women conversation. And really the initiative is around improving the diversity and inclusion results for women through better representation of the women leaders at senior level, and also advocacy for quality pro-women policies. Sometimes we talk about equality, but some of the things that, policies that are spoken about in organizations may not necessarily be pro-women. So we talk about pro-women policies, we speak about products and programs that really, really support the growth of women. From a ABSA global perspective, we've also signed up to the UN program Target Gender Equality, whose main purpose is to continue bridging the gender gap. And this is championed all the way from our group CEO and chairman. So it is something that, again, is not just in the internal DNA of ABSA Kenya, but also at ABSA as a group. Now, from an internal perspective, speaking towards the customer, in 2021, we took it up, we sat together, first of all, as the women in the bank, and said, look, we need to also be able to focus on how do we support women, to provide them with financial and non-financial support. So we launched our premier ABSA She a business account, and She really means see her empowered. And this is a really powerful program that we launched in 2021 that seeks to first and foremost empower 1 million women across the Kenyan country. We look to be able to support them in terms of financial and non-financial information. And then we also put a fund of about 10 billion at that point in time to ensure that we could support women in being able to provide them with facilities. So as we speak today, we find ourselves right in the middle of the 5-year term that we had set across to make sure that we could empower 1 million women. And we find ourselves at a point where we've given out facilities of up to 5 billion shillings, which is a really commendable piece, considering that at that point of launch, there were very few organizations that were willing to support women and, unapologetic. We have partnered also in this particular initiative with others, because the reason why we do it that way is we can't afford to do it alone. So we have very able partners whom we've shared our values with, and we found areas where we can collaborate. So we speak to International Trade Center, we partner with Kenya Chamber of Commerce, we've partnered with Kenya Association of Manufacturers, KEPSA also is one of our partners, Organization of Women in Trade. We speak to quite a number of organizations because the aim is to make sure that we can reach out to the women, make sure that we can empower them in different conversations, and really, really make perhaps Kenya a better place than we've found it. Apart from that, we've also partnered with DFIs to ensure that we can be able to find like partners who can support us in the risk conversations that we have with women, just making sure that we can empower them along the way. And to my earlier point of being an influencer, we then say, after we've done all these things, put a really fantastic proposition in place, we also get support from our corporate clients because, women are in those corporate clients. How can we reach out to them to make sure that they're better empowered? This is a conversation that continues along the way. And we hope to achieve our goal, as we progress with the partnerships that we have. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I think as we move towards closing, I think I would like to delve a little bit into the impact that some of these initiatives have had. There's some actual startling statistics that have been coming through around the representation of women on boards around Africa. Very good statistics coming out of Kenya, where over the last 5 years we've seen, and this is by, there's different measures for different things, but almost coming up to a 36% in some cases, down from lower than 19, less than 5 years ago. We're seeing this in Ghana as well, and there's other areas. And I wonder if you could maybe give us a hypothesis of what it is that is driving this, and whether you see some of the initiatives and benchmarks that are happening maybe influencing this. What do you think is causing this progress we're seeing?
Yeah. So just to give you, take a step back and speak about some of the figures that you've spoken to. An organization called MSCI, Women's on Board Progress Report 2022, spoke about women, holding 24.5% director seats in 2022. Up from 22.6% in the previous year. When you come into the African continent, I think we're doing a little better. Even as we extrapolate it to the Kenyan the country, From an African perspective, 30.5% according to Boardroom Diversity Index report speaks that, every 1 in 4 board directors in Africa is female, which is very interesting. Maybe there are not too many boards, I'm not quite sure, but it's a good figure to embrace and use as a stepping stone. But closer home in the Kenyan context, we have a number of initiatives or things or models that really we should be able to take advantage of. And yet we find ourselves not quite, taking full advantage of those. Maybe I'll speak to 3 things. There is the Constitution of Kenya, 2010. The country's supreme laws mainstream gender equality by stipulating that no more than 2/3 representation by either gender in any institution. That is a fact. And we find that, a lot of the time, it's a fact that we don't take full advantage of. And perhaps as women, as different bodies, as different organizations, both from the public and the private sector, we just need to push that agenda to make sure that that representation is actually taken up as per the laws of Kenya. We also have the Capital Markets Authority. In 2025, the CMA issued the Code of Corporate Governance Practices for Issuers of Security to the Public, which stipulates that the appointment of board members shall be gender sensitive and shall not be perceived to represent a single or narrow constituency interest. Now, again, it's something that we've started to see, different groups of women coming together, women in boards, organizations, just making sure that we can push that agenda more aggressively. And I think by and large, women are beginning to put their hands up because of the different webinars, conversations that are taking place. Women struggle with being able to articulate their, the force of their CVs. A lot of times we hide things because we think that perhaps we're boasting if we speak too much, but this is an opportunity again, that is clearly stipulated under the Capital Market Authorities that we can be able to sit on the board and provide our views in a more productive manner. I think the third one for us is the Nairobi Securities Exchange, which I spoke about earlier a little bit with the initiatives that we have jointly put together with them. And the NSC places special focus on enhancing gender equality among listed companies such as Absa Bank, and undertakes key initiatives towards achieving gender equality. Every year, NSC joins over 75 stock exchanges globally to ring the bell for gender equality. That cannot be taken for granted. We need to be able to take advantage and perhaps influence the different corporates that we find ourselves with to ensure that we can then follow through with the agenda of empowering more and more women in their companies, getting to their boards, and just the constitute of their organizations. I think I'll pause there for now.
No, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to pause because I think it leaves us on a very optimistic note. On one hand, you are saying there's these provisions in the Constitution, there's provisions from the capital markets regulations and the stock exchange, and these are guidelines. Many times you don't get hauled off to jail as a board if you're not equitable, but the fact that they're there, I've been in many boardrooms where this conversation is happening all the time and genuine efforts are being made to push and see what can we do. So the fact that there's awareness in the back is what I'm really seeing as a catalyst, because when ABSA started with their 50-50 and some of these initiatives and supporting others to think about this, then we see the statistics coming through for Africa. Sometimes it's not always the first thing to come to mind to see that your efforts are bearing fruit. But for me, what I would like the audience to take away from that is that these things make a difference and that we are seeing these numbers shift in a way that is very encouraging. This is not to say we've reached the end or that we relax now, but the fact is that some of these things really, really do move the needle. And it's something that we can all get on board with to push the agenda, as you call it. So I think then we can stop there. Elizabeth, I thank you so much for being here, for your support and for sharing and everything that ABSA is doing to move this issue of women's leadership forward. As we've heard, it's a catalyst, and when you have more visible women, other women follow suit. So I want to thank our speakers very, very much. This has been a wonderful conversation to moderate. Thank you for having me. And I'd like to invite Daniel back as the MC to close us out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists, a big thank you to our moderator for sharing your knowledge with us on the realities and myths on the gender pay gap. And to all our attendees, thank you for taking the time to learn more about the pay gap and engaging on the chat on social media, and just absorbing this quite educative and informative session. So the Aspen Institute's Initiative for Africa will continue to host these thought-provoking and enlightening dialogues that are civil, non-partisan, and data-driven. Please follow us on social media. Our social media handles, as mentioned earlier, on Twitter at Aspen Africa, and on LinkedIn, Aspen Institute Africa Initiative. And from there, you'll keep getting information on some of the upcoming events. Some upcoming events that you can keep an eye out for: the discussion with Mackenzie and Oxford University on the recent Mackenzie report, Africa Journalism in the Digital Age, Wakanda, Africa's Past and Future Romanticized, How Corruption Works, a New Lens with Dr. Ang from Johns Hopkins, and a Socrates seminar later on. But all in all, we'd like to thank you to all of you for joining us, and we'd like to wish you a good evening, good morning, or good day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
My name is Angela, and I'm the first Kenyan to win a Wimbledon Grand Slam. My sister Rosie and I are tennis players, but tumetoka mbali. We were orphaned tukiwa wadogo, and our life became such a struggle.
To forget our challenges, our uncle took us to the tennis court. Hapo, all our worries went away. The sport became our inspiration, our escape, and we were determined to keep practicing and pushing our game.
Until one day, we made it to the top of international tennis. Kama sisi tuliweza, there is no reason you can't too.
Against all odds, Angela and Rosie found a way to bring their dreams to life and became international tennis stars. We believe you can also do the impossible. That's what we call Africanacity. Whatever your goals, join ABSA today, and together we can get things done.